Hello and welcome to a special edition of All in the Mind on BBC Radio 4, recorded live at the Royal Institution in London. We're in front of an audience with a panel of guests to discuss the psychology of something that we all do, making snap judgments. Much of the time, these shortcuts serve us well and save us time, but sometimes we get it wrong and end up making unfair assessments about other people. This is known as unconscious bias. And although the word bias is in there, it's not deliberate. The whole point is that we don't even know we're doing it. So I want to take this relatively well-known example. Some of you might know this. It's a riddle. So a boy and his father have been in a terrible car accident. The father dies in the crash, and his injured son is rushed to hospital for surgery. But when he's on the operating table, the surgeon looks down and says, "I can't operate. This is my son." So what's going on here? Now, I remember hearing this when I was about 14 and being so upset when I didn't get it. So I'll leave you to puzzle over that for a moment. Now, psychological research is increasingly showing that these biases can have a wider impact than we might realise. So today, taking the field of science as an example, we're asking how you can detect unconscious bias, what difference it's making to the lives of each and every one of us, and what we can do about it. Now, we have four wonderful guests here to shed light on these biases, and they span psychology, sociology, and education. And we'll hear briefly from each of them in turn. But before that, back to this riddle. So remember, the father has died, the son is in the hospital, but the surgeon says, "I can't operate, this is my son." Now, when I first heard this, I remember thinking, so is it his stepfather? Does he have two gay fathers? Is the surgeon a ghost of his father? What could be going on here? Every possibility except for the actual answer. Now, lots of people might have heard this before, but I wonder if there's someone here in the audience who hasn't heard it before, who thinks they might know the answer. Could you put your hand up if you do? It's very bright, so I can't see. Oh, there's somebody just here. Could we get a mic to the person? Oh, or just there. Some passing of the mic. That's marvellous.
It's his mother.
It's his mother. That's right. Very good. Did many people here get that? Did everyone get that straight away? Some of you, yes. So it is a bit easier in the context of a discussion like this, but of course, yes, women can be surgeons too. So why is it that a picture of a male surgeon jumps into many people's minds and won't shift and they can't work this out? Could this be a classic example of unconscious bias? So to explain all, first up, we have the business psychologist, Professor Binna Kandola, who's been researching unconscious bias for many years and is the author of 2 books on the topic, and he's going to introduce us to the world of bias. Thank you.
The last 50 years has seen a transformation of attitudes towards social groups. In the 1960s, for example, 80% of people viewed African Americans as superstitious and lazy. By the turn of the millennium, those figures were 2% and 12% respectively. By the 1990s, compared to the 1960s, Britons were far more accepting of minorities as neighbours and of mixed marriage. And whilst in the 1970s, surveys containing questions such as sons in families should be given more encouragement to go to university than their daughters, by the 1990s, so few people agreed with these statements that it was almost pointless using them. So we are, on a range of issues, more liberal, more tolerant, and more egalitarian than we were 40 to 50 years ago. These are important shifts in attitudes. However, whilst we shouldn't take these changes for granted, we shouldn't take them at face value either. Rather than disappearing, our biases have, like viruses, mutated. The attitudes that have changed are explicit. They are overt and obvious. Intriguingly, we also hold implicit or unconscious biases, ones that we are not even aware that we have, and which may be in conflict with our explicit attitudes and values. And these can have an impact on our decision-making. Approximately 130 professors of science were asked for assistance. They were asked to evaluate a CV and to determine the candidate's competence and to recommend a starting salary. They were all given the same information, except for the name. One half received a CV in the name of John, and the other half, the candidate was called Jennifer. On a scale of 7, John was evaluated 4 in terms of his competence. Jennifer was rated 3. And for starting salary, John was recommended a salary of $30,500 and Jennifer $26,500. Now, the people who responded, they were scientists, they were well-educated, they were senior, they had some standing, and they would almost certainly have endorsed egalitarian values. And yet, there was a marked discrepancy between their decisions for a male and female candidate. And in this study, there was no difference in the responses between male and female professors, which leads me to my final point. We are all biased. So let's not be biased about the people who we think are biased.
Thank you very much for that, Binna. So next, how does this bias play out in real life? Well, since we're here at the Royal Institution, we are using the example of the field of science. So let me introduce Jessica Rowson, who works at the Institute of Physics. And her job is to look at why more girls don't choose to study physics at school. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you. Okay, so it is set out in law that we should treat people as individuals. No one should be treated differently because of the colour of their skin, their sexual orientation, or their gender. However, people still form unconscious biases from observing patterns around them, and that can affect their behaviour to different groups of people. For example, if the majority of physicists that someone sees are male, that person will associate physics with maleness. They may then be surprised coming across a female physicist and ask something like, "So, tell me, how did you get into physics?" You may think that this show of surprise is innocent enough. However, imagine you are that female physicist and you hear this question over and over and over. There is that message that you don't really belong gets constantly reinforced. We, as a society, have very strong biases around what's appropriate for girls and what's appropriate for boys. Boys should like cars, they should be loud, rough and tumble, dress in blue. Girls should be quiet, hardworking, aspire to be princesses and not like getting dirty. These stereotypes are inherent in our society and are constantly reinforced by mass media and advertising. However, they are misleading. Not all girls like pink. Not all boys like football. There are more differences within genders than there is between them. These stereotypes are harmful. They can limit the aspirations of students and contribute to teacher and parent bias, which can lead to different treatment in the classroom and at home. The very language we use can perpetuate these stereotypes and expectations. How often have we heard, "Can I have 2 strong boys to carry this?" At secondary school and primary school level, there's very little difference between their physical characteristics in terms of strength. So why is the Institute of Physics interested in this? For decades, only a fifth of those taking physics in England are girls, even though both genders perform equally well at the age of 16. What is interesting is that that small number of girls taking physics comes from a very small select group of schools. For example, in 2011, you were 2.5 times more likely to go and take A-level physics if you went to an all-girls school. And around half of the maintained mixed schools in the UK sent no girls at all on to do A-level physics. So the schools that tend to have a poor gender balance in physics also tend to have a poor gender balance in art and psychology and English, with few boys taking those subjects. So maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't with girls and it's not with physics, it's more about what's happening in that school environment and how boys and girls are experiencing schools differently. So if we want more women to become technical professionals, we need to start at school, but we need to be looking beyond the science departments. And, right, okay, that was the opening speech. Now we're going to get a little interactive, which all gets very exciting. Okay, so you've been prepped, you've been asked to get your mobile phones, the mobile devices out and log on to the Wi-Fi. What I would like you to do, excellent, I can see loads of phones out there. What I would like you to do is go onto the website, www.menti.com, and use the code 268255. There's a question on there. And give me 3 words that you associate with girls. I don't want you to think too hard about this. I want these to be non-filtered. There's no judgment happening in this room tonight, okay? So any 3 words that you just associate with girls. Don't look at the screen until you've submitted your words, because obviously I don't want you to be biased. So excellent. There are some results that are starting to come in at the moment, which is very interesting. So I'll just leave you to get a few results coming on in there. Excellent. So we can see some of those results filtering in, which I love the fact that strong is coming out as a nice big word there. Pretty, slightly bigger. Interesting. Okay. We've got sweet, nice, cute coming in, but we've also got powerful, intelligent, smart, independent. It's good. Okay. So we've got lots of words that we're associating with girls. The bigger the word, the bigger the word, the more people have said it. So you can see that pretty and strong, clever, hardworking are coming out quite big there. Independent, pink, cute, wonderful. Okay, lovely, excellent. What we're going to do next, because we believe in equal opportunities, we're going to go on to 3 words you associate with boys. So if you can just press the arrow on the side there. Excellent. Wonderful. Okay, so hopefully a new question will have come up for you. 3 words you associate with boys. So you've done it once, you've probably got the knack of this now, so...
Can you say the words?
Pardon?
Can you say the words that are coming up so people know why they're laughing?
Okay, excellent. Okay, interesting. You can hear a lot of laughter. No matter how many, I'm always surprised, and I shouldn't be because I've done this quite often now, how often smelly comes up and how big it actually is. So again, strong is very big, annoying is big. We've got dirty, ugly, tough, loud. Interesting. So we've got very different words that come up for girls and boys. This was just a little exercise, just show that we all have those gender stereotypes in our heads, and some of them are very common. Excellent. If we could flip to the PowerPoint now, please. Thank you. Interesting. Okay, so this is an exercise that we go out and we do with schools quite often. We do it with students, so you can see that students also have these stereotypes. So you might say, okay, yeah, girls like makeup, boys like football. So, and you might go, yeah, whatever, I'm not that bothered. You've got to think about, it can affect students on a number of levels. So they've got these strong stereotypes. They're wanting to fit in with their peer groups, but maybe they don't like some of the things associated with their gender. Can it make life quite difficult for them in school? The second thing that's... Oh, I have the clicker. Hang on, let's see. Right, wonderful. There we go. The second point is that it does limit their aspirations. So this is a word cloud that they've made based on... careers that they think are suitable for women and careers that they think are suitable for men. Look at the number of careers that they think are suitable for women. It's a lot less and a lot more restrictive than the ones they think are suitable for men. Also, based a lot around their appearance, which is quite interesting. So everyone has unconscious biases. There's no getting around it. We all have unconscious biases here. It's based on our experience. We're not to blame for having those unconscious biases. Basically, our brain is always looking out for patterns, and that is so we can form processing shortcuts and we can react very quickly. So they're incredibly quick acting. They can lead to unfavourable reactions sometimes when you're talking to different groups. They're more prominent in terms of stress. So part of my job is working with schools, very high-pressured environments, so a lot of these can come out in the classroom environment. They're difficult to change because they're pretty hardwired into the brain, but they can be managed and your behaviour can be managed. If you're interested about testing your own biases, do Google Harvard IAT test, and there's some tests that you can do on there that test your own unconscious biases. Wonderful. Whose word clouds do you think these are? Any ideas? Teachers, yes. So this is a selection of word clouds from teachers. Very interesting how they have they've got expectations of their students based on genders. It's fine to have these biases, but they need to make sure that they are laid at the door when they go into a classroom. So yes, they've made the pattern that sort of boys are loud, but not every boy is loud, not every girl is organised and creative. There's a lot of academic research out there which shows that this can affect the experience of boys and girls in the classroom, that it can lead to different types of praise. Girls is based on their appearance, less critical. Boys is based on their work. When boys get the same praise as girls do, their performance tends to suffer as well. There's inherent expectations by gender. Teachers expect sort of boys to sort of get science, whereas they know and be inherently clever, whereas girls are hardworking. And teachers will work with the boys to reach the answer, whereas the girls, they may see the girl trying and say, well done, but never mind. Both the expectations of teachers and students and these biases can lead to sort of a boys dominating in the science classroom as well, which further leads to the feelings of exclusions for the female students. Just a quick true or false. Our biases, our common misconceptions. Girls are more emotional than boys. Put your hands up if you think it's true. So put your hands up if you think it's false. I like to do that, just make sure everyone's engaged. Wonderful. It is indeed false. Girls and boys are equally emotional, but just girls may be a little bit better at expressing some of those emotions. Girls are more self-critical than boys. Put your hands up if you think it's true. Put your hands up if you think it's false. Excellent. Girls are more self-critical than boys, and this is something that teachers need to be aware of, because if you've got two students of equal ability, boys will tend to put themselves higher, girls will tend to think themselves lower, and therefore not volunteer for experiences, etc., because they don't think they're worth it. The male brain is better adapted to scientific subjects. Remember, no judgment here. Put your hands up if you think it's true. Put your hands up if you think it's false. Excellent stuff. There is very little, but I do acknowledge there's more experts on the panel than me about this, but there's very little evidence to show there's much difference in brain structure. The female brain is slightly smaller, but has more grey matter, I think. So the processing power, is very similar. So a bit like a MacBook Air. Okay, excellent. The critical thing that I wanted you to take home from the true and false is overall there is more variance within groups of boys and within groups of girls. So, so these general patterns shouldn't be of concern to the teacher. They should be looking at students as individuals rather than based on their gender. What can be done? We're working with schools, training school staff on unconscious bias, and also how to deal with sexist incidents as well. Teachers are very well versed on homophobic and racist incidents, or at least there's improvements made in that area. Sexist incidents are slightly less well trained, and we're supporting schools to reflect on ways that they can counter gender stereotyping. But you're not an audience of teachers, you're the lovely public. So what can you do? Be aware of your own unconscious biases, give yourself time to think, be conscious of your language and what unconscious clues it may be giving, and discuss with friends, family, colleagues, etc. Challenge any sort of stereotypical behaviour you can see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Jessica. I was trying so hard there to make sure I didn't think of stereotypical words about boys and girls there, and they just come in your mind. It's terrible. You can't stop it. It feels like you can't. It's terrible. But someone who doesn't seem to have been put off studying physics when she was young, which is good, is Emma Chapman, an award-winning Royal Astronomical Society fellow based at Imperial College London. And she studies the early universe, and she's seen just what impact these biases can have in real life.
Hi, I'm Emma, and I'm an astrophysicist based at Imperial College London. My research involves looking at the signals from the first ever stars and galaxies to exist in our universe, about 13 billion years ago. It's a signal so small that we have to gather a huge amount of data just to be sure that we're actually seeing what we think we're seeing. I've been doing this research for around 7 years now, and during that time, I've experienced a mixed bag of bias. I've had 2 children during my research career, And while I've come across several biased maternity policies, for example, I've not really felt any animosity from my colleagues for my decision to have children, at least not that I know of. And that's the problem when we're talking about unconscious bias. It's that we're talking about thoughts that are really, really quick, so much so that even the person thinking it isn't actually sure it's happened. So there's not really much point me resorting to personal anecdotes at this point. Instead, we need to do what I do in my daily research life. We need to gather a huge amount of data, and we need to try and see through the data whether we can find out about unconscious bias. And when we do that, the evidence is actually very clear. Women and minority groups are biased against at every single point of their career, whether in academia or whether in the larger scientific workforce. And once you've seen this kind of injustice, it's actually very difficult to look away. And so for the last couple of years, alongside my scientific research, I've been trying to consider how this bias can become embedded in university life. Because after all, every university or institution is run on a set of rules or a set of policies. And for example, if somebody makes a claim of sexual harassment or wants to go on maternity leave or wants to know if there should be a gender quota on a panel they're running, they'll refer to these set of policies. But while these policies seem like sterile words on a web page, they've been written by a human being or a set of human beings with their own set of biases, conscious or unconscious. And so for me, bias in science isn't just about the individuals biasing against other individuals. It's about how that bias can all come together and embed itself in the very fabric of academia, to the detriment not only of the people being sidelined, but to the productivity of science itself. Okay, so I'm just going to expand on that a little bit now. I come from a UK background in terms of my research, and I've studied in a variety of different departments, from being in quite an anomalous gender-equal PhD programme in my year at least, to being a much more normal 10% female fellow at Imperial College London. But there's little point resorting to personal anecdotes, so let's go straight to the data. And there's more and more studies on this coming out these days. So one of my favourites from a couple of years ago is a group of researchers blanket emailed professors in the United States. They did this across institutions and across academic subjects. And what they found was a lot. It's a huge paper, but two things of real interest for me. The first is the shocking ethnicity bias, and that's what they did was they sent out identical emails to professors requesting a meeting to discuss a PhD opportunity. And these emails were identical apart from the name on the bottom of the email, which indicated different ethnicities and different genders. And what they found was that, for example, if you're an Indian male, you're around 60% more likely to have your email deleted, completely ignored. The other thing that's quite interesting for me about this study is that it shows that gender bias is actually dependent on ethnicity, or at least correlated with ethnicity in some way. For example, while you see that white females are around 13% more likely to have their email completely ignored, which is depressing enough, really, when you actually go to the Indian ethnicity, you might notice that actually Indian females are more likely to get a reply to their email than Indian males. So the gender bias is reversed in that ethnicity. But the major point of this study is that right at the start of your career in academia, when you're just applying for your PhD, it's an uphill struggle if you're a woman or an ethnic minority. Not very happy. But say you actually get your PhD, say you do a fantastic job, because why shouldn't you? You get your references, you get your papers, and you start applying for what's called a postdoctoral research position. It's the natural next step. Well, it turns out there's bias here as well. This is a really interesting study. There was a study done by a set of Swedish researchers quite a while ago now, but they actually went to court to get the records of all the postdoctoral applications in 1 year to the Swedish Medical Research Council. And what they found was that the people assessing these applications rated women lower on every single metric they had, for example, scientific competency, relevance of research. And not only that, but the researchers looked at the publication records of all these applicants, and they found that women had to have published 3 extra top-tier papers. So these are papers in the hardest journals to publish in the world. They had to have 3 more to be considered on an equal footing to an equivalent man. So yet again, uphill struggle. Now let's say you've got through your postdoc and you start applying for your permanent position. Now we've already heard about Jennifer and John, and poor Jennifer was being sidelined. Well, I've got a slightly older study which basically makes the same point. And that's that they did the same thing. They had identical application packages with Karen and Brian. And for every Karen hired, there were 2 Brians hired. So it's no wonder that when the Institute of Physics do absolutely fantastic job of gathering data on all the physicists in UK academia, for example, you can see women dropping out of the pipeline, the leaky pipeline as it's called in many fields, but that's how we refer to it in physics as well. So whereas you might start off, for example, 20% women in the postdocs, by the time you get to the most senior positions, so professor, you're more likely at about 7%. So 7% of physics professors in the UK are women. It's not surprising that this kind of bias exists in universities even today, because after all, we're talking fairly recently, certainly in my own astronomical timelines, that women were even let into universities happily across the world, really, certainly in the Western world. And when you look in the textbooks, you can draw hundreds of women, of ethnic minorities, of different sexual orientations, all of these people who have had their science sidelined, and how whole fields have been just put to a stop because people simply didn't like the people that were doing it. So to pick one out of the air that I find really interesting, Hertha Ayrton, she was an incredible physicist at the turn of the 20th century, and she was so incredible that even the normal discrimination at that age couldn't stop the Royal Society from awarding her the Physical Sciences Medal. She was the first woman to win this medal. And interestingly, the second woman to win this medal was actually in 2006. So that's 100 years between the first woman and the second woman, which is absolutely shocking. And just for a correction, the first woman to win it, the second woman was in 2008. There we go. Right. But the thing I find interesting about Hertha Ayrton is even though she was recognised in her day a little bit, she wasn't actually allowed to be a member of the Royal Society or a fellow of the Royal Society. They tried, she had lots of champions, but the lawyers went over the policies and they found that actually a married woman was simply not a person eligible for membership. So I find this really interesting because it's a case where actually there was momentum behind getting a first woman fellow in the Royal Society, but it was the policy, it was the written words that stopped it. And in my own field, in astronomy, we've been seeing a lot of changes recently. There's been a lot of discussion of different ways of improving this kind of bias. And it's led to certain things, for example, mandatory codes of conduct at conferences, which is fantastic to see. And in universities, I work a lot with gender diversity in different universities, and unconscious bias training is becoming the norm. However, for me, you have to have things coming from the top down as well as the bottom up. You have to have the people in power willing to change the policies so that when you get this great amount of momentum to get gender equality, to get sexual orientation equality, etc., it's not just stopped dead by some written words on a website. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So we've heard plenty there about the impact it can have in real life. Now, our next speaker comes from a different field, from sociology. Louise Archer is Professor of Sociology of Education at Imperial College London, where she runs long-term research on children's science and career choices. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks. It feels very subversive to be a sociologist speaking at a psychology event. So, as we know, bias and inequality is unfortunately very much the way of the world. And as we've been hearing, from a psychological point of view, this is talked about in terms of unconscious biases, cognitive shortcuts. From a sociological point of view, we're actually interested in how inequality is reproduced through social relations and social structures. And so a key concern for us as sociologists is how bias is not random. It's very much patterned. And it works in ways where the elites tend to reproduce their privilege and keep hold of it, and life is very difficult for people at the bottom. And despite everything we hear about social mobility, it's often quite hard to achieve in practice. So over the past 10 years, we've been researching what this means in the case of science. And science provides a depressingly good setting for looking at issues of bias, because we have very clear and consistent persistent patterns over time. So we know that women and people from working class backgrounds, minority ethnic backgrounds, tend to find it much more difficult to stay on and persist, particularly to higher levels. And as we've been hearing, for example, the situation of girls in physics is particularly acute. There are also very tiny proportions of women in engineering, and figures show that England has the dubious honour of being the worst in the world for the proportion of women in professional engineering. So we're interested in why is this? So some of the current popular ideas that you might have heard of are that maybe girls are less interested in science, maybe our brains are not set up in the right way, or as we've been hearing tonight, unconscious bias can play a part. But our research on the ASPIRES project over the last 10 years, with over 37,000 young people to date, suggests that some of these ideas are either not holding up or they're not the whole picture. So in particular, I want to try and talk about how and why inequalities in science are not just unconscious, they're not just inevitable, but they're very predictable and they're very much social products. They're the products of schools, society, the education system, and science itself and its own cultures, and the ways in which these combine to actually channel and restrict young people and really make it really hard for most young people to continue in science. So I'm going to say that if we want to understand issues of bias, we need to look at issues of power. And this is going to mean questioning some of our dominant ideas around gender and around what science is and how we do science. So I'm going to be arguing that if we want to improve and broaden participation in science, then we don't just need to look at the individual and what's going on in our heads, but we need to fundamentally look at the way we organise society. So I shall move on. There we go. So first question is, why is science so unequal? Well, as we know, we need to unpack that a bit. There are different patterns of participation at different levels, as the other speakers have been talking about, and between different areas of science. So it's not quite as bad in biology. It's much more acute in physics, if we're talking about gender, for instance. And a lot of time, money, effort, and resources have been put into trying to change this over the years, but it's really resistant to change. And I think a key aspect of that is because it's very much to do with science being a high-status, high-stakes area. So this area matters. People have a vested interest in keeping it the way it may be. So our research suggests that it's not just that young people aren't interested enough in science. So there's just a graph there that basically shows that the different colour blocks relate to different age students. And when we ask them different things, for example, do you think you learn interesting things in science? Over time, the blue block is the young children aged 10. The block, the purpley sort of colour block, is them aged 15 to 16. Actually, a lot of students say, yeah, we learn interesting things in science. And an encouragingly high number are saying that. They also think their families value science, which again is good. Those are very high graphs there. And they also, it's not that they think all scientists are geeks. They think things like that scientists do a great job. They are valuable to society. They also think scientists make a lot of money. Not all scientists agree, but they think that. But the last little block are people, it's like, do you aspire to continue with science or to have a job that uses science, or be a scientist in this case? And you can see there's a big gap here between the level of high interest and valuing of science and scientists, and actually hardly anyone wants to continue with it. And that's pretty low from age 10, and it doesn't really change much as they get older. So we call this the being-doing divide. Kids like doing science, they have good views about it on the whole, they just don't think it's something that's for me. And if you look at who's within that little block of people who do aspire to be it, they're very much patterned. They tend to be white and South Asian middle-class boys. So we're interested in what causes that. So from a sociological perspective, we'd say this is very much a social issue, not just psychological. Lots of things come into it. As we've been hearing today, teacher stereotypes are an issue. The public stereotypes we've been hearing about and that you've all been contributing to with the excellent word cloud that I really enjoyed, these are all playing a part. When we talk to the students in our study, even the girls who are continuing in physics, they recognise that it's a very masculine area. They haven't got different views to everyone else. There's a quote up there saying from a mother who's saying, well, it's not very girly, it's not very sexy, it's not very glamorous. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not actually a scientist, but school cultures also play a part, and as Jessica was talking about, it's not just that girls don't like it or girls don't want to do it. When they're in girls' schools or co-ed schools that really strongly push girls to do physics, then they do it in much greater numbers. So that's a cultural thing. And we know that there is this discourse of physics being very hard, and that affects different students in different ways. Different students find it easier or more difficult to position themselves as very clever or very brainy or doing a hard subject. The education system also makes it really hard for students to continue with science. And I think this is important for contextualising the unconscious bias, because even if you really like it and want to do it, it's quite difficult. We have a segregation, a streaming effect of students from about the third year of secondary school, so sort of age 13, where you either go on to the prestigious triple science route or the double science route or other routes. And it's only really the very prestigious triple science route where you do it as 3 separate A-level GCSEs that allows you to go on to A-level. And only about 25% of students do that. Not all schools offer it. Schools in more challenging circumstances tend not to be able to offer it or only offer it after school. So there are all these social factors that are streaming kids out. And then when you get to A-level, if you want to do an A-level in English, you can often get on with a C. If you want to do an A-level in physics, you have to have an A or an A star. So there are all these hurdles and barriers that are working in that. Homes and families make a difference as well. And the sum of it, girls get the message that this isn't really for you, and they tend to obviously feel less confident in this area. From a sociological point of view, French sociologist Bourdieu, who liked to come up with very arcane and obscure terminology for everything, suggests it's the interaction of what's called habitus, capital, and field. Basically, habitus is what you're socialised into. It's your feel for the game, what's normal for people like me. Capital is your resources, the hand you can play in the game, and field is essentially the rules of the game, the social context. And when you put this into a science situation, you can see that actually these things together mean that those girls who continue into A-level physics and beyond are incredibly exceptional. They are not usual in that sense. They tend to come from families that very strongly value science. Their families are reading New Scientist, for example, talking about science at the table. There's a quote there, laughing about chemical symbols in the car. We all do that, don't we? And the girls who continue with physics are saying, well, I recognise it's a masculine area, but either they don't identify as particularly girly themselves, or they're proud to be different. They like to stand out. They like to challenge people's expectations. There's another quote there from a girl who was at that point aspiring to engineering, saying when she told her friend she's thinking about engineering, it's like, ooh, why would you do that? They thought it was all confusing and gross. And these girls who continue are very high attaining as well. And there's a quote at the end from a girl called Davina saying, well, maybe that's the beauty of it. You get to be a really special person. So the sum of this is that the social plays a role as well, and that we as a society make it difficult for girls and young women to continue. So hopefully a sociological understanding can help us open up this. And really, I think it's important because when we come to figure out what we're going to do about it, that makes a difference for what we think the causes are.
Thank you to all of you for those introductions. Now, Binna, if I can start with you. You know, Emma was pointing out there that it's not just about the mind's shortcuts, that we must take the social context into account. Is there a risk in the study of unconscious bias from a psychological point of view that we neglect the whole social context of why this is happening? Yeah, exactly. I think it's really important. I think that sociological context, the beliefs we have about men and women, and the explanations we give for why things happen. I mean, you mentioned about somebody mentioned about not all boys like pink, not all girls like pink. There was a study that was carried out by psychologists that found that boys do prefer blue and girls do prefer pink. And it was explained in evolutionary terms
that it made sense for boys to prefer blue because in hunter-gatherer societies, they'd be better able to pick out objects against the sky. And it makes sense for females to prefer pink because they're in hunter-gatherer societies as gatherers, they're better able to find berries. I mean, seriously, how hard is it to pick out something against the sky? And have you ever seen a pink berry? My wife and I have written a book about gender bias, and we refer to this. We refer to this as theory YDD for Yabba Dabba Doo. It's essentially taken the Flintstones not as a cartoon, but as a reality TV documentary. That Fred and Wilma are us, and we are Fred and Wilma, and we kind of make up stories to explain what's going on today. Whereas when you look at anthropologists and we were investigating all of this, and you find that, in fact, hunter-gatherer societies are best described as gatherer-hunters, that the roles were interchangeable. But that doesn't fit. And that's a sociological thing. I mean, that's actually kind of, we create stories to explain what we see in front of us, rather than to trying to say, actually, we created what's in front of us. And it's far better to say that these differences between men and women are natural and enduring. It's nothing to do with me. So I think it's really important.
And Emma, you've been looking back at the history of this. In science, as in many areas, as you said, these biases go back a long way, don't they? But you've been looking at, I thought it was interesting, in how women scientists get described.
Yes, I find that because gender bias in physics is such a common subject now, there's a lot of awareness around it. And so whereas in the 70s, for example, it would have been commonplace to have quite negative words used towards physicists that were female, certainly. I mean, certainly in the 1940s, they were simply known as computers. That's what they were called. The first 1940s Harvard women were computers. That was it. But now you have this positive stuff. You have that you're organised, that you're empathic, that you're a good team player. This kind of thing, whereas the men, it's that you're a good leader, etc. And this comes out in references. There's been studies on the references given in academia, and it is all these action words which are given in the male references, and all these feeling words which are given in the female references. And so even though it might seem from the outside that we have a much more gender awareness in science, it's almost a negative feedback effect, because yes, I might say that some of the terms are complementary. I'm quite happy to be called a team player, but not at the expense of being a good leader, which I can be both. But it's that because nobody mentions that I'm a leader, I'm a team player. And that's it.
And Binna mentioned that people can, of course, have these biases against their own group as well. And Jessica, I was wondering what you have found the main factors are that seem to influence girls' decisions to study physics, and how much is it to do with their concepts of themselves as well?
So, there's a sort of number of factors that come into play. So girls tend to be slightly less confident than boys. If you've got two students of equal ability, girls will tend to sort of underrate themselves, whereas boys will tend to overrate themselves. When you get a subject like physics, which is falsely perceived as hard — physics isn't hard, by the way. It's good fun. Then they may tend to sort of opt out. Also looking at sort of relative performance across subjects. So girls tend to, the data shows that girls tend to outperform boys generally across all subjects, and they outperform boys by a wider margin in things like English and arts. So for them, relatively, they'll feel that they're better off in the English and arts, even though they're still slightly outperforming the boys in a subject like physics. So they may, again, sort of opt out of that physics, which is a crying shame.
So, Binna, you can have unconscious bias against yourself, against your own group, if you like.
And it's very common. So you'll find that the least dominant groups, the less dominant groups, actually have a bias towards the out group. So that they're more likely to have a bias in favour of an out group. So women will have a bias in favour of men, for example, for leadership roles. And it's very important to recognise that when we talk about gender bias, that we're not just talking to men in the room. We're talking to everybody. Actually, and so it's not so gender. When you're looking at gender bias in an organisation, it is not self-perpetuating. that there is this kind of belief that if you get enough women into leadership roles, then it becomes self-perpetuating. Actually, it isn't. You need to pay attention because the women will have the same bias as the men have. In fact, there's a client of ours, a retailer, and they promoted more women into senior management roles, and they thought, that's it, we've done it. And then a few years later, they found that they were back to where we were before because the women were promoting men just as much as the men were. And so it's something you cannot afford to take your eye off.
And we've talked so far about unconscious biases being this very negative thing, but it doesn't mean that all unconscious processes are negative things, are they? I mean, we do need these shortcuts.
Yeah, and they work. They work. And so in the main, they do work. And what we're talking about here, all of us talking about this evening, is actually some of the bugs in the system. That's what we're talking about.
So when are the shortcuts good?
The shortcuts, if you've got an enormous amount of experience, for example, I mean, people talk about 10,000 hours of sport. I mean, but work's been done with chess champions, and they kind of find that with the more hours they put in, the more they can anticipate what's coming up. And they can do it in the flash of an instant. I was in a taxi today, and the taxi driver just kind of said, do you mind if I go this way, that way? I don't know what he's talking about, but he said, yeah, of course. He said, and we talked about it. He said he didn't even think about it. He just knew. And he said that, and of course, it's fantastic in those situations because you've got the experience. Now, where it's not good, and people will say, actually, you can't have somebody working part-time. Why not? Well, I had 2 people before. And so your data set is 2. And from that, you're drawing these huge generalizations that somebody who works part-time is not motivated. And that's where it becomes problematic. But of course, it's fantastic in those situations where you've got the experience to back it up.
And Louise, even though you want us, of course, to take the bigger social context into account, do you think it's still useful to be doing, tests where you're trying to, where people are like Binna are trying to do psychology experiments to see whether there are these biases that we don't realise?
Yeah, my view would be that's a key part of it. I'd also like to broaden the picture. And I think unconscious biases, it's really helpful in lots of ways because organisations are starting to take it seriously, as the other speakers have been talking about. They are doing stuff and training people on interview panels. I think it could be slightly problematic or hindering in that it's quite comfortable. So as a member of a dominant social group, if it's all unconscious, it's not my fault. And that's quite comfortable. And actually, some of it is working in our interests. So I think we need to hold on to the importance of power. And actually, it's not just that everyone's unconscious bias operates equally. People in more powerful positions, they have bigger ramifications of it. So,
and how easy is it to measure, Binna?
Well, you can measure the impact of it. I mean, several people mentioned about unconscious bias training. And I think this point about people taking responsibility for it, you can't be blamed for having unconscious bias, but I think you can blame people for not doing something about it. And so often you kind of find people go, yeah, I've got unconscious bias, whatever. And well, actually, you have responsibility to do something about it. And this isn't a question about attitude anymore, it's a question about motivation. And I think the real issue now in organisations is how can we get more people to be motivated to do something about their own biases, which is a different question, actually.
Jessica, you've worked with teachers who've been having unconscious bias training. Mm-hmm. How do they react? Is there this kind of, it's not my fault, I'm not doing anything? Is it difficult not to make people feel guilty about it?
I think all the teachers we work with are extremely passionate about doing what's best for their students. And the science teachers we work with are very passionate about getting more girls on to do A-level physics. They recognise that is a problem. Part of the work we do is kind of working with teachers so they can kind of assess whether there is a problem in their school or not. For example, we may ask someone to sit at the back of or they may ask someone to sit in the back of their classroom, just kind of note who's answering the questions, who's sticking their hands up, who's shouting out. And it can be a surprise to some teachers to just the extent to which boys may be dominating in their classroom. The solution is very easy. It's basic teaching techniques that are taught in PGCE courses. But just stressing the importance of these in the context of making sure that everyone has an equitable experience in the classroom is really important.
And I can see why teachers would be surprised, because no teacher's going to think that they treat boys and girls differently.
In fact, a lot of them are kind of like, no, and it's helping them just reflect on what is happening in the classroom.
And so, Binna, what happens in unconscious bias training?
It depends, actually. If you've got data from the organisation, you can obviously share, you can reflect that data back to people and kind of try and get them to explain what's going on. But typically, it would be kind of trying to make people aware of some of the bugs in the system, that we are making shortcuts, and that there can be also kind of visual tricks and illusions that you can use. We can have discussion about stereotypes. Part of the point about the unconscious bias training, though, is actually to get people to talk about this stuff. And to talk about topics like stereotyping, like we were looking at the screens earlier. Because what I found over the last 10 years is that people are becoming more and more reluctant to talk about what's in their head. Because they're concerned. If I display knowledge of a stereotype, I will be judged as if I hold them, as if I believe them. And so actually there's a suppression of discussion going on. And what the psychology research around this shows is that is not going to reduce the bias. In fact, it may even strengthen the bias because you're not having the opportunity to argue it out with other people. So part of it is just to create a safe space where we can talk about some of these things.
You were agreeing over here that there's more of a reluctance to talk about it.
I was just saying that one of the problems we come against actually is convincing people that there is a problem. You have to have data, especially if you're in science. People don't believe anything until you have data. But when you sit down in a meeting and you say, look, we've got 7% UK female professors, we need to figure out why. Why don't we, for example, get the post-op applications and check that we're not being biased? Well, that Swedish research group had to get a freedom of information request to do that. And you find that again and again, that people just don't want to release the data because they're scared of being the first ones to do it. They're scared of being the ones that they'll do it. They'll say, yeah, we've got a problem of bullying or harassment, and then nobody else will say anything and they'll be left alone.
Louise, do you think unconscious bias training is enough? Is awareness enough? Does it work?
I think it's an important part, but I don't think it's enough. So I think that we can see that even if we trained all the teachers, for instance, and made them wonderfully aware of their bias and unbiased, we've still got structures in place that reproduce the problems. So if we don't look at those, we're constantly having to reinvent the wheel and keep battling against the tide, as it were. So I think it's really important to take that broader view. So, how do we organise science? How do we stream people in it at different ways? What do we think is doing science well in the classroom? So a lot of the classrooms that we sit in, there's an idea that if you're being quite confident, almost arrogant, you're using lots of scientific terminology, that's being scientific, that's the way you do science. But actually there's lots of ways you could do it. There are more collaborative ways, there are ways that may be more comfortable for other students. So I think there's the whole package really we need to look at, from the curriculum to the structures to what we think doing science is.
Binna, how much evidence is there that unconscious bias training can work? Because as you said, we need these mental shortcuts, so we can't just banish them, will we? They'll still come into our minds. You know, the words about the boys and girls still came into people's minds.
Just in terms of awareness, at the level of awareness, anywhere where people have been through unconscious bias training, talking about teachers, lawyers, doctors, anywhere between a third to a half of people will still leave the training, think it's not about them. So even when you provide the training, it's a good point to start, but there's still going to be a significant proportion of people who kind of think that this is, even though you're being told it's everybody's bias, a significant proportion of people will still think it's not about them. So but the training can help. But the other things you've got to question is actually the policies in the organisation, the way we do things in the organisation, and some of the things, unfortunately, you have to question is the diversity and inclusion policies of the organisations themselves. Why do we need a business case for gender diversity in an organisation? Why do we need that? Well, basically, when we say gender diversity, you mean women. Why do we need a business case for women as leaders? Why don't we need a business case for men as leaders? Why do women have to provide an explanation why they have a right to sit at the table when men just assume they can sit at the table? Well, that's actually sexist in itself. So even the fundamentals of this are wrong. And then when you look at a policy and this is a mantra used by many organisations for diversity and inclusion, men and women are equal but different. Men and women are equal but different. Men are logical, analytical, decisive. Women are compassionate, caring, and empathetic. And you get a combination of the skills together, and you get a perfect team. In fact, this is a reproduction of the age-old stereotypes that men are competent and women are emotional. I mean, basically, that's what this, the women are communal. And the point is being made earlier, actually, fair enough to call me a team player, but there's something known as the innuendo effect. And if you don't mention logic, analytical, and decisive in terms of a description of woman, we assume it's missing. And so this is really important. I mean, the way we describe that, but this actually forms the basis of many diversity and inclusion policies in organisations today.
And so this is exactly what you recognise, Emma, that your certain characteristics are being picked out.
Yes, absolutely. And it's an argument that we haven't even solved in the field yet. For example, there are Women in Physics awards. There are fellowships just for women in Europe where that's allowed. And it still splits the field now about whether that's allowed, whether we should be saying Woman Physicist of the Year. What does that mean? And then, exactly the reference question I talked about before. So you see this every day.
And Jessica, it seems as if it's really not that easy to get real change here, because there have been lots of attempts within physics to change things and get more girls to do physics, haven't there?
Indeed.
And they haven't necessarily worked.
The percentage of girls doing physics is around 20% and has been for the last 30 years. And there has been lots of organisations wringing their hands going, what can we do? And so there's been lots of talk about wheeling out sort of role models and girls need role models. Well, that's, So boys don't need role models, or what is the logic behind that exactly? So we looked at the data, we looked at actually what could be the problems, kind of what could be some of the bigger issues going on here, and which has led us to kind of thinking more about not just what is happening in science, what is happening with girls, but what is happening on the whole school environment.
So what do you think we do need to do then? If all these past things have tried and not worked, do you know the answer?
We don't know. I think we have to start somewhere, and we think that looking at a combined approach, looking at not just what's happening in the science department, but also what's looking across at the whole school is an important place to be starting.
See, I think that's a really interesting idea. So it's not just necessarily about getting more girls to do physics and saying, isn't it a shame more girls don't do physics? But you mean maybe it might be about looking at, well, as why don't more boys do English? We might be missing out on...
Indeed, or why are
boys
underachieving? We hear a lot of schools asking. So maybe that's just a different side of the same coin. Maybe there is actually gender issues, gender stereotyping issues that are affecting that as well. So, yeah.
Binna, how much would you say psychology as a discipline can really do to make society more equal in this way?
It can provide a lot. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I love psychology so much. It can help to explain what's going on, and it can help provide solutions. When it comes to a topic like unconscious bias, I think the explanations are getting richer and deeper. The solutions, we've still got a lot more work to do on the solutions, because some of the things that work in the lab, will they work in real context? And actually, when people do them in real context, and some of the things you ask to do in a lab can be, if you ask a manager to do that, push a joystick backwards and forwards to manage their bias. I mean, you wouldn't get very far with a recommendation like that. But so we're learning more, and we're learning more about what we can do, but there's a lot more about the implementation and the actions that we need to concentrate on.
And can I ask each of you if you have a tip for how we can avoid unconscious bias ourselves, or how we can avoid stereotyping ourselves? Louise, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think developing an understanding of inequalities is really important. So one of the challenges I think our teachers face is that in initial teacher education, when we're training people to be teachers, they have very, very little, maybe a seminar if they're lucky, on trying to understand what all these inequalities are. So we have all these poor science teachers who are out there who really, why should we expect them to have a really good understanding of intersecting inequalities when that's not been a part of their education at all? So I think I would start there for a start, importantly. And I would also, in my ideal world, I would like to train all policymakers as well in understandings of these things, because obviously that, I think there is the capacity to change more things at a bigger scale there. So.
Emma, what do you think we can do as individuals, perhaps in our own lives?
For me, it would be get to know your bias well, like the back of your hand, and don't be ashamed of it. I've done the IAT tests, and I know what I'm biased about. I think that women should be mothers, apparently.
So these are the tests. These are the tests you can do online where you see what's what.
highly biased towards saying that women should be at home in the kitchen. But there you go. I know my bias. I'm aware of it, and it comes into everyday life. For example, reading journal articles every day, I try and avoid looking at the names and the institutions at the top before I start reading a paper, because instantly I can hear myself go, ooh, etc. So.
That's interesting. Jessica, what do you think we can do?
I think it's important to treat people as individuals. You know, don't make any early assumptions about people. If you feel those assumptions creeping in, question why are you making those assumptions, and actually get the facts in front of you.
Binna, what would you say? What are your tips?
I'm kind of along the lines of Emma, actually. I think just a sense of humility about this. This isn't somebody else's. This isn't about everybody else. This is about me. And I kind of start with myself, that I am as biased, if not more biased, than anybody else around me. So don't assume. I mustn't assume that I'm better than other people, because I'm not. So do you think
after all this research that you've done on this, you're still not avoiding the biases yourself?
Well, I just know that I'm biased. And knowing that I'm biased helps me helps me not to act on them. But that reaction, I was asked by somebody a little while ago, actually. She said that she had somebody came to an interview and he had a tattoo on his face. And she said, and my first reaction was, you're an idiot. She said, how can you stop me having that reaction? That was quite a challenge, actually. I said, well, actually, I can't stop you having that reaction. But you can decide how you work with that reaction. If you give yourself another moment, if you think, OK, you've got a tattoo on your face, you're an idiot, you're not getting this job. Or you can say, you've got a tattoo on your face, I think you're an idiot. Now, I'm going to do the best I can to give you a proper interview. It's that. All it takes is a moment to stop, understand our reaction, and move forward from there.
Oh, and let someone prove the opposite of what you were thinking.
Well, that would be a proper scientific appraisal. Yeah.